This is a story of the Appalachian Mountains and the people who live there. It is a story of a missionary, John C. Campbell, and his wife, Olive Dane Campbell, a school teacher and ballad collector.
Swing your partner and promenade like a little red wagon.
It is a story of mountain culture, mountain crafts, mountain music, and mountain life. And it is a story of a journey that defined the boundaries of Appalachia and brought to the mountains a school that thrives today.
Olive Campbell had the notion that if you set a place up where you bring people together and give them interesting things to do in a supportive atmosphere, the people end up not only learning, but having a great, deep love for learning.
This is the story of the John C. Campbell Folk School.
A production of UNC-TV and the John C. Campbell Folk School. Funding for this program was made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by
United Community Bank is proud to support the John C. Campbell Folk School and to serve communities throughout Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. United Community Bank, the bank that service built.
By the late 1890s, railroads were beginning to enter the most isolated parts of the southern Appalachians, including the western mountains of North Carolina. A passenger could board a train in New York City and in only a few short days be deep within this mysterious and exciting territory.
We fueled and built the nation with our coal and oil and gas and the timber that built a lot of those mansions in Newport and other places.
George Vanderbilt built a 250-room mansion on 125,000 acres near Asheville. But few in the region could relate to such wealth.
The Appalachians were seen as a people still living in some ignorance and in inadequate housing judged by someone else, and on hillside farms not necessarily using the best of agricultural practices.
Appalachia drew others as well, teachers and missionaries who saw in the mountains an opportunity for service.
No other places than Africa and China have attracted more Christian missionaries to come, but they were saving people who call themselves Christians already.
They came from the North, from New York and New England colleges and seminaries. Among them, a young man named John C. Campbell. Campbell was born in Indiana in 1867. His mother, Barbara, was from Bavaria. His father, Gavin Campbell, was a Glasgow Scot who came to America and worked his way from railroad mechanic to superintendent of the Chicago and Northern Pacific Railroad. The family was prosperous and able to send their son to Williams College and Andover Seminary in Massachusetts.
I think he was a man of great faith, and also that he felt that his fairly privileged upbringing required him to give something back.
In 1895, Campbell, who had just graduated from Andover, became principal at a rural mountain school in Joppa, Alabama, where his work brought him face to face with the harsh realities confronting his students, especially the poverty.
As he looked down, day by day, into the young faces before him, so hopeful and some so full of promise, his heart ached for them. Olive Campbell.
For the next 6 years, John Campbell taught in rural schools in Alabama and Tennessee. But as the 20th century began, John's career shifted to higher education. After marrying his childhood sweetheart, Grace Buckingham, in Wisconsin, the Campbells moved south to Demarest, Georgia, where John joined the administration of Piedmont College. In a few years, he was named president. Life in Demarest proved difficult for the newlyweds. The financially strapped college required John's tireless attention. Then, in March 1904, after an extended illness, Grace Campbell died of tuberculosis. Grief-stricken, John threw himself into his work. For the next 2 years, he struggled to raise money for Piedmont College. Exhausted from overwork, he grew gravely ill. His doctor ordered bed rest, and as a last resort, an ocean voyage. In June 1906, John packed his bags and set sail for Glasgow, the land of his father's people. On board ship, John Campbell's life took a sudden and dramatic turn. Her name was Olive Dame, and she was traveling to Scotland with her mother and sister. A graduate of Tufts College in Massachusetts, Olive Dame at 24 was a school teacher, and like her fellow traveler John Campbell, called to serve humanity through education.
Of course, they met each other, and he realized that this was the love of his life. She, I think, was the bright and sunny part of his self that he didn't have. He was serious, he was driven, and I think she brought a lot of fun into his life.
I get a feeling from Olive Campbell of a woman who was funny and had a sense of humor and was caring about other human beings and really carried herself gently and softly upon the earth.
Upon their arrival in Glasgow, it was only natural for John and the Dame family to travel through Scotland together. By trip's end, John and Olive were engaged. They were married in Massachusetts in 1907. Together, they headed back to Piedmont College. But the couple's stay in Demarest would be short-lived because of a new dream, a journey through the mountains of Appalachia to study and survey the region and its people. In 1908, John wrote to the Russell Sage Foundation for financial support.
To fit out a wagon in which to dwell, to travel through the country in this way and come into intimate touch with the people, learn their needs, and see what they themselves are doing to meet those needs. Such a method seems necessary. John Campbell.
On June 20th of the same year, the Russell Sage Foundation Executive Committee granted John's request that a grant of $3,000 be made for a study of the southern mountain communities. John Campbell resigned from Piedmont College.
'Twas in the merry month of May, the green buds were swelling, poor William on his deathbed lay, for the love of Barbary Ellen. He sent his servant to the town, to the place where she was dwelling, saying, "Love, I have a message for you, if your name be Barbary Ellen."
At the turn of the 20th century, what most Americans knew about mountaineers was based on the local color movement, dime novels and monthly magazines that either romanticized or vilified regional life in the West and the South.
Young man, I think you're dying.
I think a lot of their characteristics were exaggerated and are romanticized. Even the business of the ballads. Not everybody sang ballads, but people who loved the ballads like to write about those people that did sing the ballads and give the impression that you could walk into any home and they could sing Barbary Allen for you or something like that.
The need was there for somebody to sort of sum up and synthesize the information that was known about the mountains, and especially just to go and talk to people with the purpose of finding out what their life was like.
So in the fall of 1908, John and Olive set off on their journey. John asked Olive to keep a diary of their trip.
I recorded experiences faithfully, in detail as requested, from weather and character of terrain, to persons and personalities, what was said, and how it all seemed to me personally. I am impressed as I read it over by our almost constant activity day after day for months at a time. Olive Campbell.
In those days, women rode side saddle, and that's not easy, particularly on mountain trails where you're sort of looking down the side of the cliff and feeling a little bit insecure, you know, with both feet on the same side. But what impressed me was that they apparently stopped at every county seat and every little academy or school to inquire about the needs of the people and to try to write up some kind of honest survey of the needs within the region.
The Campbells, I think, were exceptional in this regard because they didn't, like so many missionaries in so many places, arrive thinking they knew all the answers, but rather that they would ask the right questions.
John was insatiable. He pushed travel as fast as he could and let no opportunity slide for gathering new information. Olive Campbell.
As the Campbells traveled from northern Georgia to eastern Tennessee, eastern Kentucky, and western North Carolina, they pondered how best to bring education to mountain people. They realized that mountain people had a lot to learn, but they also had a lot to teach.
The Campbells found these mountain folks to be living in a world that they mostly had made. The objects in the house, the houses themselves, everything was pretty much still handmade stuff, and this was not the way it was in the cities.
These were pioneer people of, as Mr. Campbell wrote later, roughly thirds. They were German, they were English and Welsh, and they were Scotch-Irish. And they represented somehow the seed corn, if you will, of the nation.
This happens to be one of the richest areas in Appalachia for what's called old-time music, Appalachian old-time music, that would include the old narrative ballads and folk songs that came from England, Ireland, Scotland.
And all she said when there she come, sweet man, I think you're dying.
Young ladies would sing for her these songs like Barbara Allen that she knew. You know, she knew a version of Barbara Allen. Hers came out of a book. Here was somebody who was singing their family version that had been passed right down through that family for many, many generations. And she realized that she had caught the tail of a wonderful tradition. She started to write down the words and the music.
They, more than anyone else, were able to embrace the mountain people and see the good things in their culture, like the ballads, which she got fascinated with and collected.
The Campbells concluded their survey in 1909 and set about to do something no one had ever done: define the boundaries of Appalachia. John and Olive created a detailed wall-sized map of the region.
And he, probably more than anybody else, is the guy who said, here is where it is, this is its boundary. He defined the borders of Appalachia, and ever since he did that, everybody else has had to react to his version.
By 1912, the Campbells had settled in Asheville, North Carolina, where under the auspices of the Russell Sage Foundation, John set up the Southern Highland Office. The purpose? To marshal and coordinate the efforts of governmental, civic, and religious organizations that were providing services to mountain people.
He was one of the first who realized that people in eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina maybe had more in common than people in western North Carolina and eastern North Carolina. That they had shared history, shared cultural traditions, and that they faced similar challenges.
This was an exciting and hopeful time for the Campbells. On April 1st, Olive gave birth to a baby girl, Jane, in her hometown of West Medford, Massachusetts. But joy soon turned to tragedy. Weak from birth, the baby's heart failed. John was devastated.
It is hard to put into words just what this loss meant to him. A tiny creature full of personality and intelligence, she had been to him the hope and center of his life, of the new home to be established in Asheville. She was everything he wanted her to be, except strong. For a while, he bent beneath the blow. Olive Campbell.
In their interviews with mountain people, the Campbells had asked, "What do you hope to have in the future?" Education was the answer.
No one that I know has yet solved the problem of rural education. Something is wrong in the schools of our mountains and in our rural schools generally. The greatest defects arise, I think, from attention being concentrated upon the individual rather than the community. I have been drawn to the ideals of the Danish folk school because somehow the Danes have found a school for peasant youth, a school resting on a cultural basis but sending forth students with such altruism and practical knowledge as to have remade Denmark, economically, socially, and spiritually. John Campbell.
The Danish word for this kind of thing is folkehøjskoler, and it means folk high school. The folk in the name didn't mean that they were set up to teach folk art or folk music or folk crafts. It was that they were a place to bring folks together. It was a school for folks.
Danish folk schools were based on the ideas of Nikolai Grundtvig, who proposed schools for adults without grades, credits, or competition.
Grundtvig was a theologian in Denmark and an educator. He had a real desire to see all Danes have an equal access to education. So in the 1840s, right around 1844, he started the first folk school in Denmark.
It was a short-term school for young adults, intended not to impart exact knowledge for its own sake, but to awaken, enliven, enlighten. Olive Campbell.
The most important part of the Danish folk school idea was that it had no grades at all. And I think that the reason maybe this appealed to the Campbells was that they realized how difficult it is for people, especially mountain people who are very proud, to end up in a contest and not be first.
The Campbells determined to investigate the Danish folk schools firsthand and booked passage to Scandinavia for August 1914. But the outbreak of World War I put their travel plans on hold. As the war raged in Europe, John focused his efforts on educational social work in the mountains. And Olive turned her attention to the musical treasures she had collected during their journey through the southern Appalachians. Realizing the historical significance of the ballads, Olive wrote to Professor Cecil Sharp, the foremost authority on English folk balladry. When Sharp visited America on other business, Olive showed him her ballad collection.
I waited in silence as he turned the papers. From time to time, he looked up to ask, "How does this go?" Or, "Will you please sing that?" Then abruptly, "How did you take these down?" I explained that I had to learn each song from the singer, getting him to repeat again and again until I knew the tune and had written down the words. I would then hunt out a piano or organ, by no means always available, and set down the tune as well as I could, from my notes and memory. Olive Campbell.
You know, he probably said, well, no, that's not how one does it. So he went out with his shorthand notepad, visited the same singers, and noted their singing as they went, and found out she'd gotten it all right. And I love that because she used folk education. She used the same process that had gotten those ballads through their first 300 or 400 years of existence. The process of actually learning the song from somebody to the point where you could sing it yourself.
With Olive's assistance in making introductions, Sharp gathered several hundred additional ballads. In 1917, they co-published Folk Songs from the Southern Appalachians, which would become the definitive collection of American mountain folk songs and ballads. In addition to Olive's book, the Campbells had another cause for celebration: a new arrival, Barbara. The family spent the summer in Nantucket, but again, their joy was short-lived. Like their first daughter, Jane, the baby was weak. By October 1917, she was dead.
Cold mountains all around me here, the water's gliding down the stream. Oft times in my sleep I think I find her, but when I wake 'twas all a dream. And when I woke I could not find her. All on my bed I weep and mourn, tears like a river without number, because that I am left alone.
The grieving parents once again returned to Asheville. Then, more bad news. The deep pains in John's chest were more than grief.
The tracings of the sensitive machine revealed what the human eye could not discover. The heart muscles were not functioning properly, and there was no help for them. Nothing for us to do but to accept the record with what courage we could. Olive Campbell.
John Campbell was dying of heart disease, yet he refused to stop working. After resisting for years, he decided it was time to write a book about their journey through the Appalachians. In 1919, on his way to an important meeting in New York, John and Olive ran to catch a train in Washington, D.C.'s Union Station.
My only memory is of our hurrying down the long platform in Washington Station on May 2nd to catch an earlier delayed New York train. A sad mistake. And John's collapse as he reached his seat. That was a long trip, and I wondered if it would ever end. Olive Campbell.
When the train arrived in New York, an ambulance drove John to his hotel.
I think they knew he was dying. John called Olive to his side and he said, I want you to write down some things. And she wrote as he spoke. And after he had said what was in his heart, and Olive had written it and put the last period down, he died.
A grieving Olive Campbell traveled to Nantucket, to a little house called Cachalot, which the Campbells had built from an old hay barn. Here she determined to finish the book John had started.
He wrote only a chapter of that book before he died, and then Olive Dame Campbell took all of their notes and his notes and put that book together. And it's a remarkable book, I think. It was the best book for the time on Appalachia.
And when it was published in 1921, it says, The Southern Highlander and His Homeland by John C. Campbell. And you know, she must have been proud to see that name because she knew it was his work. But it was certainly her work too.
With World War I over and the Southern Highlander and his homeland completed, Olive Campbell set forth on a new mission: to study the folk schools of Denmark. In 1922, under the auspices of the Russell Sage Foundation and American Scandinavian Foundation, Olive, her sister Daisy, and a young school teacher named Marguerite Butler arrived in Denmark to fulfill John Campbell's wish to learn firsthand about the Scandinavian folk schools. Marguerite Butler grew up in a prosperous Cincinnati family. A graduate of Vassar College in New York, she began her teaching career at Pine Mountain Settlement School in eastern Kentucky. Olive and Marguerite visited folk schools in Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. What they found were hands-on, non-competitive schools where students and teachers lived together, ate together, and had deep conversations.
They realized that it's not just the time in class that makes for a learning experience, that the time that people spend together outside of class is equally important, meal times especially.
Olive Campbell was impressed with what she saw. Upon their return home, Olive and Marguerite were ready to establish an American folk school in the Southern Highlands. As Olive started work on a book about their trip, Marguerite searched for a location for the school.
Murphy, North Carolina is the county seat of Cherokee County, and in 1925 it would have been a 4-street town down around the courthouse. Had a hotel on the corner called the Regal Hotel.
Checking in, Marguerite planned to keep a low profile and ask a few discreet questions when she was visited by a storekeeper from Brasstown, a village just 8 miles down the road.
Fred O. Scroggs and his dad came to her the very morning after she arrived in Murphy and said, we heard you were looking for a place to put a school. She said, you need to understand this school won't certify anybody in a trade or a profession. And Fred O. was a kind of person with a pencil on himself and got a pencil, wrote it down. She said, this school's not going to prepare anybody directly for college entrance program. Wrote that down. She said, you need to understand that this school's going to be based on the principles of the Danish Folkehøjskoler. And Fred O. wrote that down, and then he says, isn't that the ideas of Nikolai Frederick Severin Grundtvig, the Dane?
Fredo was very much interested in having a school start here because he was pretty much of a politician. And when they said it was a school just for ordinary people, that was even better because he didn't think you had to be a preacher or a teacher in order to want to go to school.
On Monday, November 16, 1925, a community meeting was held in Brasstown, North Carolina.
Brasstown sits between Murphy, the county seat of Cherokee County, and Hayesville, the county seat of Clay County.
The local newspaper, the Cherokee Scout, reported on the meeting.
At a meeting of the citizens of the Brasstown and Peachtree communities in the Brasstown Church Monday night of this week, Mrs. John C. Campbell and Miss Marguerite Butler announced that they had decided to locate an experimental folk school in the locality, the Cherokee Scout.
Fred O. Scroggs really was, I think, the key to the whole thing. He got the rest of the community organized around the folk school idea, and he talked his parents into giving 75 acres of land to this new idea. So the school started off with this huge donation.
He was the sort of progressive leader of the community. He might have known something about these schools, but I doubt that his father and mother did. I think they just wanted a school.
Fred O. was also instrumental in convincing local residents to build the school. Olive and Marguerite's dream of a folk school in the mountains was about to be realized. Dedicated to Olive's husband, it would be called the John C. Campbell Folk School.
When the very first classes were held here at the folk school, Mrs. Campbell and Marguerite were teaching a real wide variety of subjects. Also in the beginning, meaning 1926, 1927, they also were looking at things like geography, talking about various places in the world, what these places would look like, what the culture would be like.
The original 6-month program attracted young people between the ages of 18 and 25 who planned to become farmers. Courses ranged from reading and writing to crafts, group singing, and folk dancing, which was called singing games because some local church people disapproved of dancing.
it was partly a perception of what dance is. And there was even a lot of humor about, you know, dancing, that God seemed to be more concerned about dancing than he was about murder and mayhem and other such things, because dancing was the one thing you point to that might lead young people to think of something else, you know.
To help run the farm, Olive and Marguerite brought in a farm manager from Denmark. George Bidstrup had experience with agricultural cooperatives, Danish folk schools, and was also a teacher of gymnastics and folk dancing. 10 years after his arrival, George married Marguerite Butler. For the school's motto, Olive took a line from a poem by the Danish poet Mads Hansen, "I sing behind the plow."
It means enjoy your work. You need to enjoy whatever it is you do. And people who have to push a plow have to sing behind the plow.
Early in the history of the school, Olive Campbell noticed a group of loafers sitting on a bench at Fred O. Scroggs' store. And these gents were carving on pieces of wood. And, you know, I'm sure she asked them, what are they making? And the traditional answer to that is shavings.
So Olive encouraged the Whittlers to carve animals and human figures, which the folk school would sell by mail order. This was the beginning of the Brasstown Carvers. A teacher at the folk school, Murray Martin, led the Brasstown Carvers for over 30 years.
Many, many, many Brasstown carvers have repeatedly told me it was the sale of the carvings that clothed everybody and bought the automobiles and bought, you know, the special things that were needed in life.
Times became hard as the Depression hit. The folk school helped the Brasstown community form associations to assist the local economy: a dairy cooperative, a crafts cooperative, and a credit union.
They created a Brasstown credit union, which was set up to loan money just in, I think, a 5-mile radius of Brasstown. The loans were secured by people's character. They were giving money to people based on the fact that they knew them and they knew they'd pay it back. And they got all their money back.
Also in the 1930s, a New York photographer arrived in Brasstown to take pictures of the folk school and its mountain neighbors.
Doris Ullman was one of the great photographers of the 20th century. She lived on Park Avenue and she was kind of a society photographer. She took pictures of people like Albert Einstein and Charlie Chaplin and Calvin Coolidge.
Later in her career, Doris Ullman began taking photographs of ordinary people at work.
She did photographs of sharecroppers in South Carolina and fishermen in Massachusetts. So she was asked by Alan Eaton, who was working on a book about the craft movement in the Southern Appalachians, to take photographs for that book. And the book eventually was called Handicrafts of the Southern Highlands.
Doris spent several weeks capturing stunning portraits of the folk school staff and neighbors from the surrounding mountains.
She left the folk school with this great legacy of all these wonderful pictures.
My first impression of the folk school was when Mrs. Campbell and Louise Pittman met me in Murphy at midnight, And they were so friendly and so kind and so hospitable.
Ellie Lambert arrived at the folk school in 1940. A recent graduate of Vassar College and a native of Long Island, New York, she was hired to work in the folk school office. Ellie lived with Olive Campbell and Louise Pittman, head of the crafts department, in the farmhouse.
Mrs. Campbell loved to sing, she loved to play instruments, and she was a most interesting conversationalist. She not only had lots of interesting things to say, but she was a very good listener. She was a loving person. She really cared about other people a great deal.
While at the folk school, Ellie fell in love with a local boy who worked at the folk school's dairy. His name was Monroe Wilson. In 1941, their budding romance was interrupted.
People really panicked, really panicked. They were scared. You know, they heard it on the radio, and they didn't know where Pearl Harbor was. I think everybody knew we were going to war, and I think the people who had somebody who was going to be involved quickly were really scared. It was an eye-opening experience for people here. Without television, without many movies, without any exposure to the outside world.
As young men and women left the mountains to serve in the war effort, it became increasingly difficult for the folk school to find students to teach and workers to keep the school's dairy and agricultural operations running. The war changed Brasstown forever. Unlike Monroe Wilson, who married Ellie Lambert and returned to Brasstown, most GIs did not come home to the farm. New opportunities were opening up in factories, colleges, and through the GI Bill retraining program.
The old folk school idea didn't seem to fulfill the needs of most of the people who wanted education, but they wanted certificates and diplomas and degrees to show for it so they could go get a better job.
In 1946, Olive Campbell retired as director after leading the folk school for 20 years. A succession of leaders tried to navigate the folk school's direction through changing times. They included George and Marguerite Bidstrup, who ran the folk school during the 1950s and 60s, excelling at folk dancing.
The two of them together were very influential in folk dancing throughout this region. Probably more influential than a lot of people really know. So George and Marguerite were really, in some ways, really pioneer dance leaders in the whole southeast region.
John Ramsey, who became director in 1967, emphasized the folk school's agricultural and dancing traditions. Then, in the mid-1970s, a pair of skilled enamelists, Gus and Maggie Masters, took over amidst difficult economic times.
I have heard stories, not just from other people, but directly from Gus and Maggie, that when they got here, Keith House was locked. That's the main administrative building. It was shut down, and that they had to crawl in through a window. In the beginning, Gus and Maggie were taking very, very little salary, if any, just to keep the folk school alive.
The Masters shifted the folk school's emphasis to arts and crafts and created the Resident Artist Program and the Fall Festival. In 1976, Esther Hyatt became the first mountain-born director of the folk school.
And she did a beautiful job of integrating the folk school with the larger community. I would say that was a real turning point in the folk school history.
In the mid-1980s, Director Ron Hill raised funds to repair old buildings and expand the campus. During his tenure, a folklore program was started to collect, catalog, and archive regional artifacts, documents, music, and oral histories. Then, in 1992, Jan Davidson became the folk school's director.
Ach! Ooh! That would be the conversation around the house. Well, John.
Born and raised in nearby Murphy, and with a PhD in folklore and history, Jan's goal was to make the folk school financially strong and reconnect it with the original folk school emphasis on bringing people together.
What Jan Davidson has brought in is sort of rekindling those old ideals that Grundtvig had and that Olive Campbell and Marguerite Butler had in the beginning, of cooperation, of tolerance, of working together, of fun, of making learning fun.
I'm sorry, ma'am. What was that? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
The John C. Campbell Folk School is, I think, one of the leading proponents of non-competitive education. And it's important because so much of what we have in this world today teaches you how to be competitive. A lot of schools are set up to sort people out, and we're set up to bring people together.
There's no scoring system, no grading system in the folk school. Everybody works at their leisure, the way they want to do it. Nothing is judged as far as saying yours versus somebody else. There's no contest, no competing. And it's all for the enjoyment of the students.
I've been here forever. Well, I spent my summers here.
Martha Owen first came to the folk school as a child, interested in spinning. Now, she is the school's resident spinner.
This is different because people come of their own choice. So you have a different mentality than a student who has signed up for a course to pass for a certain degree, and they have to get the information and they have to get the grades. There's no pressure here. And as Americans in a rush-around world, we tend to think you want it, you go get it, you do it, and it's done. And spinning doesn't lend itself to that. You have to practice and try and take a break and come back and try again.
The school now reaches out to people all over the world, many from urban areas who come to experience mountain culture.
I think it's good for people to get into another world. If it's just for the weekend or for a week, it's invigorating and reinvigorating, I think, and that's very important.
This is the banjo part. Here we go. I'm as free a little bird as I can be. I'm as free a little bird as I can be.
A day at the John C. Campbell Folk School begins with morning song, where students sing and hear stories about the history of the school.
So what morning song does is puts everybody together to start the day, and they look over and they say, "Oh, what are you doing here? I didn't know you were here."
If you went to the library to try to find out about us, you would not find any factual information about mountain people. You could find out more about the bears and the mushrooms than you could about the people.
Morning song is followed by breakfast in the Olive Dame Campbell dining room, where students gather to share meal.
It's family-style serving. All the food is put on the table, and it's passed around like you do at home. They encourage you not to just sit at the same table with the same people, but just sit at different tables. Some people will take a class because they really want to learn this trade to be able to make money in it. Some are looking for a new vocation. Some are just looking for a hobby. Some people are doing it because they came with the wife or the husband who's teaching or taking a class, and they just pick the closest thing they think they might enjoy doing that week.
What I like best, I think, about the instructors here is their talent. Everyone who teaches here is an expert in what they do, and their willingness to share that.
Week after week, as you see people at the end of a week at the folk school, and you look at the things they've done, which is pretty amazing to begin with, what the crafts folks have made, what the people taking music classes have really accomplished. Many of them are beginners, and our instructors hopefully give them enough that they can then go home and continue on their own.
I've built 3 musical instruments here, a mandolin, a lap dulcimer, and an old mountain-type banjo. It's almost incredible that you can build an instrument in a week, but it does happen. And that sense of accomplishment of doing something, of looking at a musical instrument that you made yourself, there's nothing more satisfying to me than that.
Do-si-do and around you go and swing your corner, high and low, swing around and around you go. On Tuesday nights, every Tuesday night, we do a little hour-long program that's really geared towards the folk school students who are here that week. And the idea of that program is to just give them a little taste of the dancing. Do some really easy dances that they can learn relatively quickly and have some fun, and hopefully maybe say, gee, this is so much fun, I'd like to do it again. With your corner, do-si-do, and swing.
I think the folk school should be a place that welcomes everybody, and not just tolerates them, but welcomes them, embraces them, brings them in, and makes them feel at home. It's important for us to have some places in this world where life is not a contest.
The person I learned from gets very nervous when I say, you changed my life. And I'm finding it happening to me sort of right along, where people will come and say, you know, before I came there and learned what you taught me, I wasn't happy, and now I'm happy. You've changed my life.
Though the folk school has changed over time, John C. and Olive Dame Campbell's legacy still lives on in the mountains of North Carolina.
Originally, the goal of the school was a different goal, which was to educate young people. And now, there are a lot of people that live locally and work here, but the message is much wider. And we have people that are here from all around the world.
What Olive Campbell had envisioned back in the 1920s was a better world, to put it in the simplest form. She lived to create a better world.
She was a person who cared about other people and about bringing out the best in other people. To see that that thread has existed and continues to exist in Brasstown would be very pleasing to her.
She always said when she left here she planned to come back in spirit in many years and see what was going on. I don't know if she's seen what we're doing now, but I think she has, and I think she probably approves.
production of UNC-TV and the John C. Campbell Folk School. Funding for this program was made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by
United Community Bank is proud to support the John C. Campbell Folk School and to serve communities throughout Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. United Community Bank, the bank that's service-built.
Sing Behind the Plow, John C. Campbell Folk School is available on DVD. To order, call 1-800-365-5724.